All right. Thank you for joining us for today's B2B Growth Forum webinar entitled Preparing Your People for Work Life in the Post-COVID Era. I'm Doug Wendt. I'm the Executive Director of the B2B Growth Forum here in New York, and I'll be today's moderator. A few housekeeping items before we begin. First of all, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, you can communicate questions to us that we can discuss if we had time using the Q&A tool at the bottom of the Zoom webinar window. In addition, please make a note that this webinar will be recorded. It is being recorded, and so actually after the program, within 24 hours, you will receive a link with a copy of the recording available to you. We'll also be publishing it on YouTube and making it available for the public. So again, thank you for joining us, and we look forward to the conversation that we'll be having together for the next hour in this very interesting time. So with that, I will begin with introductions of our panelists. We've got four really outstanding and deeply experienced experts with different areas of focus who are coming together to lead our discussion today. So first, allow me to introduce Susan Asadi. Susan is the president and CEO of Gittenstein and Asadi Public Relations. She's a chief media strategist and co-founder of the firm. She is also the deputy director of the Global Chamber chapter here in New York City. And she has a lot of expertise with a focus on the financial services world and investor relations. And many of her clients have appeared in top New York and national and international publications. So welcome, Susan. In addition, we have Mitch Lipman. Mitch Lipman is the president of the Mitch Lipman Group. Mitch brings an organizational development perspective to our discussion today. He specializes in helping individuals and organizations achieve their professional goals through one-on-one coaching at the executive level, through strategic facilitation, training programs, and other initiatives. He is formerly the director of brand and culture at SC Ventures, has worked with NBC Universal, and has worked with Bear Stearns as well. So thank you, Mitch. We look forward to hearing from you today. Next to Mitch is Patrick Sullivan. Patrick is the Major Accounts District Manager with ADP, the world leader in human capital solutions and technologies. In addition to that role, he has previously served in sales and commercial lending positions with companies such as Robley Digital Marketing, Liberty SPF, and commercial real estate finance. So he brings expertise from a lot of different industries that are critical to the New York regional economy to his role, as well as his wide-ranging talent expertise in his position at ADP. So welcome, Patrick. And finally, Chris Wright is the global leader for business performance improvement solutions at Protiviti. Protiviti is one of the world leaders in accounting and financial strategy and consulting solutions. He's also the, or was the regional managing director for the firm's New York office. He is also on the board of the Nassau County Interim Finance Authority and is very involved in the Nassau County business and charitable communities. Previous to that, he's been a partner with both KPMG and prior to that, Arthur Andersen. So welcome, Chris. And my name's Doug Wendt, and again, I'll be serving as your moderator today, and we're looking forward to a really exciting conversation. So thank you all for joining us, and we'll get started. So first of all, let's set the stage. You know, it's interesting, it was pointed out in our pre-webinar discussion that we had a bit of an odd title because we said post-COVID. And clearly, we're not in a post-COVID era. I'm not even sure we'll ever be in a post-COVID era. But certainly, what we are in is the beginning of an era of hopefully post-crisis. So maybe we should have said post-COVID crisis. I don't know. That's an open question, but it's one that I think we want to explore. You know, the discussion about what work and life is going to be like has not only started, but actually started to be enacted with phase one return to work in New York this week. Other states are on different schedules. We're probably one of the most conservative because of all that we've been through as a city and as a region. So let's start the discussion there. You know, every one of us is a New Yorker. We return to work, sort of, in phase one this week. Do you think we're off to a smooth start? Do you believe that we'll get back to work in any regular sense? or even any semblance of a regular sense soon. And let's start with Chris, and then we'll take it from there. Chris, what are your thoughts? What's your observations? What's your perspective?
Great question, and it's good to be with you today. And thank you all for joining. We are in phase one in New York City. I live just east of New York City in Nassau County, which is part of the Long Island region. So we started phase two on Wednesday. And what I will tell you is that if New York's phase one goes as well as Long Island's phase one went, then New York will be in phase two as easily as we were. But what will define everyone's experience, I think, is the extent to which we all stick to a program that may have become uncomfortable, but it is a guard we need to keep up. And so all the discipline around social distancing and face masks, both of which we seem to have not only flattened, but actually altered the direction of the curve in our area.
Right.
All managed to put us where we are. That said, back to work, it takes on many different meanings. We have all of our employees in the U.S. and most around the globe are working remotely. And just because we can go back to the office, like many others, doesn't mean that we will. Now we know that we can, but now we'll have a plan for deciding when we choose to and when our employees choose to, when our clients want to have us on site. So really, it's progressive. It's informative to us as we move forward, but I think it's really, we need to be as cautious today as we were before phase one began.
Thank you, Chris. Patrick, you're working with a lot of different companies on what they should do, how they should move forward. What is your take looking across the world of companies that you're interacting with? How are they responding to the reopening of New York question?
I think Chris hit a lot of the same points that I'm going to address in that, yes, we're not by any means through and back to reopening. I think is maybe a wrong way to look at it. We're entering a term that I've been using recently, the next normal. There's going to be not only the shift for this NY Forward, phased approach to reopening, but the reality is we're coming back to a business environment that's going to be different from the one, when we went under quarantine in the first place. And the questions that we're addressing with our clients, working with our HR business partners, not only on the policy, updates and making sure we're kind of checking all the boxes from a regulatory standpoint, but it's really over communicating with, how businesses are going back to work with their employees, with their customers. It's things like training around those new policies and new safety measures, but also practical things like staggering shifts, or to Chris's point, if there are employees or certain groups of employees, at least, that are well equipped in their roles to work primarily from home. A lot of companies are exploring, how to continue doing that as a going forward, way of working. Updating job descriptions accordingly, things like just being overly clear with when you should not report to work if you're feeling ill again, things like that, and making sure that you're working with employees, because we still are in this in-between phase of, childcare and schools are still closed. So how does that communication work when there's an expectation that you're back in the office? How can we maybe work off hours or staggered shifts or things to accommodate? So just really addressing all those, and it is a lot of, larger policies across the entire organization, but there are a lot of one-on-one discussions about everybody's personal situations until we are kind of reimagining what the next normal looks like here.
So you brought up an interesting question that I want to explore, and I'll ask you to think about it, but I'll pose it to Mitch and Susan as we focus on the communication side of what you shared. And the question that I'm thinking about is, blue-collar operations, industrial operations are accustomed to employees coming and going on different work schedules. At least historically, the whole idea of the white-collar office is that everyone's working at generally the same time. I'm wondering what the shift in culture from one style to another in response to the requirements of COVID oriented safety is going to mean, how do we get employees to feel that there is value in coming to the workplace if the workplace itself has all of these factors built into it to protect us from the very things that, were enticements to come. So, Mitch, why don't we start with you? What are your thoughts? Like, as we think about saying to employees, come back to work, whether we're asking them or whether we're telling them, like, how do we still build employee culture at a time when we're changing the very way that's even possible?
Well, I think we with people coming back to work, and I actually have clients that are in the phase 1 area, and I have clients in the phase 2 area. And so I think in the phase 2, there are some decisions about who needs to come into the office and who doesn't need to come into the office. And I think it's very, very important that that we communicate as leaders what the purpose is, or what the thinking is, or the reasoning behind who has to come into the office and who doesn't. Because otherwise, what I've seen, and I have seen this, is, the lower level employees on the org chart are coming in while the more senior levels are, phoning in from the Bahamas, where they escaped, via their private jet, right?
Yes.
And so we have to be
No,
very
literally,
careful
yes.
that we don't create a class structure that is going to cause harm in the organization and the organizational development. That if we do, for instance, if somebody is literally calling from, and this has happened, I've encountered this in my work, working with organizations where,
Yes.
an executive is literally lying in bed talking on the phone, but they're looking out at the Caribbean,
Right.
and they're talking to a secretary or some sort of an administrative person who's in the office, inundated by work, and also, as to Patrick's point, dealing with childcare and all of this kind of thing. That there has to, maybe we don't communicate all of that. Like, maybe we don't say, "Oh, I'm looking at the most gorgeous view in the whole world," right? Maybe we sort of have a little empathy and communicate more openly about what the work is and what work needs to be done, and have conversations around how are you doing, what's it like where you are, etc. But also providing context for why the person who's in the office needs to be in the office, because there are legitimate reasons. I did hear a story of an organization that had a lot of departments, and they determined that 2 departments were essential, and those departments stayed during the shutdown. And now that, for phase 2, those departments are complaining, we don't want the other people back in the office. We're happy now. We have a lot of space. We can distance. We want them to stay away. They're going to cramp our style. We've developed a working style. So it's up to leadership to really integrate those as you bring people back, and to provide some context and communication around that assures people of safety and assures people of the value of having people working together, even if you are doing things like staggered shifts. So I think, and I think Susan can talk more about the content of that message. And but from my point of view, it's like you can't just do it and not talk about it.
So you bring up something interesting that I think perhaps is changing the nature of employee communications. And that is, we've had an unprecedented realization that employees can communicate about what they're experiencing in the workplace without it being controlled by the employer. And I think of 2 examples that pretty much bookend COVID in the Northeast Corridor. Biogen, the pharmaceutical company in Boston that literally made the front page of the New York Times as the super spreader source because their executives had a global sales meeting just at the beginning of the pandemic, and they've basically been blamed as the likely source of significant spread in the US. And then a couple weeks ago, I remember Mount Sinai Healthcare System, the New York Post tracked down their senior executives at their homes in Palm Beach. And compare that to the CEO of Elmhurst Hospital, which is part of the city hospital system, who was in the ICU along with his staff. There's an issue of optics here, but there's also an issue of employers, I think, are still operating in the mindset that whatever they tell employees is going to stay within the physical or theoretical 4 walls of the company. And that clearly has been blown totally apart. So I'm going to throw it to Susan and then come back around to each of you. What does that mean? What does this destruction of this myth of control by the employer in terms of communicating with their employees and managing their experience mean? How should that change how we communicate and how we strategize employee communications, knowing that basically all employee communications are potentially public communications? Susan?
Okay, I did want to address a little bit of what Mitch was talking about
Sure.
in terms of empathy. I do think it's really important before we talk about the public side that leaders find ways to express, how they as a leader are going to build morale and motivation and empathy towards their employees. There are companies that have been pointed out that have even developed GoFundMe pages for employees that have been furloughed. I mean, things like that. How are you going to help people that aren't going to have health care anymore besides COVID, which is being covered? But issues that are really obvious, financial and healthcare issues, I think are ways that companies can build their personal brand right now, because a lot of people are talking about what they're going to do. But I think really, elaborating how they're going to do it goes to the public side of the communication. What kind of programs are you actually doing? How are you communicating that to the employee? How are you going to build their confidence when they go back into the workplace? Because now it's going to be a very antiseptic type of dynamic if you go back into the workplace.
Right.
How are you going to do that? So, I mean, examples that you gave, in terms of companies that actually, how did they respond if they were actually, part of the problem? I think that sort of goes to that issue of, okay, now, even if you're 75% of your employees are going to stay home through phase 2 and phase 3, what are you going to do to educate your employees, for when they do go back to work, or how they are going to interact with customers? And there are ways that people can do that. Obviously, using press releases, using blogs, insights, social media. But you need to build some kind of consistent program. I mean, we used to talk about crisis management all the time. If this is an example of a crisis, this is probably the best example of a crisis. And I would say for companies, this is really when you need to have a really good crisis management plan, because as you mentioned earlier, Doug, people are out here communicating in all kinds of ways on LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook, whatever.
Right.
What they're feeling and how they're going through it. Well, what if something they're saying is actually against the brand of the company? How are you going to preserve that? And I do think, now it's time that we're sort of getting to, not post-COVID, but, we're sort of maybe past the highest crisis point here in New York until we get another wave, if we do. We need to get those policies out right away. And I think not only should those policies be going out to employees, but I don't think it would be a bad idea for leadership to be posting, on LinkedIn, on, leadership platforms such as Medium or whatever, how they are dealing with this and what makes them unique. What's their personal brand that's going to make them unique after this crisis is over? So, those were some of the things I was thinking about.
Do you think, and we'll start with you, Susan, and move through the group, I think, do you think that we're in a place where we can give employees a high degree of comfort that they can return to the office and A, be safe? I should say the workplace. Obviously, offices are one format. But A, be safe, and B, actually enjoy it. People need to feel that there's some reason to come other than just because that's where a desk is, obviously. So what are your thoughts? Do you feel like we can cross that bridge?
Well, my thoughts are particularly in New York because, many of us, like Chris pointed out, he's on Long Island. I don't know how often he comes in. And Patrick, I know you've been working a bit outside of the New York area. My dynamic, it's like, I'm not going to get on public transportation. And a large percentage of the public, even though they're cleaning those subways down 1 to 5 in the morning, I'm not going to trust going into that petri dish. So I think it's going to be really hard to ensure people, I think, until we get to the point where we might actually know there's some vaccine that could be tested in a large way. Within a company, I think maybe it would be a good idea to start communicating what their timeline is. I mean, I don't think it's a bad idea. I know a lot of people are scared to actually say, but to give a sense of what they're thinking, because the colleges are doing it, as Chris pointed out earlier, the universities are doing it. Why can't companies start saying, okay, when I see this, like our governor has done, when we get to this phase, then I'm going to do that. I think companies might come up with some kind of benchmark. When we reach to this point, then we are considering bringing back, a low level of staff. But about having fun in the workplace, I mean, I think, there are areas, that I've been reading about, including some of the articles like I read in the New York Times today, where these conference rooms that used to hold 14 to 20 people now can only hold 4. So what is it you can do to encourage, small interactions with people once they do come back? Maybe it's a scaled, a timed workday, where some people come in, for 3 hours, the next group comes in another 3 hours, and then, as at the end of that work period, whatever it is, maybe there's some kind of once a week a lunch or reception or something like that. Some kind of activity that will not only engage them, but also I think it's really important, and I'm going to stop talking, is that employees, employers, CEOs, find ways to acknowledge their remote employees, which most of us are. Are there ways that they start to award and acknowledge what they've done through this period of time, and do that not only within the company, but also publicly announce those kind of things?
Wow, you just brought up a really interesting point, which for some reason I hadn't really thought about, which is it's challenging. I think a lot of energy is going toward the challenge of welcoming employees back to the physical workplace and all of those questions, right, as a part of the reopening. But at the same time, we were not prepared, generally speaking, to have high numbers of people suddenly working from home. And that requires thinking about how to create intentional culture. Chris, what are your thoughts on both fronts?
A few things, Doug, and thank you. The culture, obviously, if you've been around, you have a culture that you're able to maintain, which I think is better than trying to create one from scratch. But think about, here's where it gets challenging. First off, as it relates to bringing people back and making them feel that they're going to be safe and have a good time, I think right now, since it's hard to say you have a plan unless you have a plan for an office and you're in a place that you know what zone you're in. If you're in a multi-office environment, you should communicate your principles first. So our principles would be: you're going to be safe, you're going to be productive, and you're going to be healthy. And from that, every plan emanates. And so if you're in the suburban office and you're on the second story, you don't have to worry about elevators. But if you're in a city, you probably have to be concerned about thinking about elevators. But think about culture for the new employee. A red carpet onboarding experience typically involves coming to the office, meeting everybody, getting to know people, lunch and dinner, whatever the days or 2 days of programs and that. And now it is, welcome to the firm. Please open the laptop we FedExed you. And, someone from IT will now zoom in and talk to you about about how to set up your email. And so you lose the ability to some extent to build culture for new employees unless they're comfortable and you build in that expectation. And so then how do we maintain it? Millennials thrive on, for example, collaboration and knowledge sharing. So leave a Teams, a Zoom, or a Skype meeting open all day for a team. It's like having a room you can step into, right? You can knock on the door. It's like knocking on the door down the hall and asking somebody for advice. You leave a room open. Everyone has it open.
Yes.
Things you can do tactically that allow you to maintain culture. I would just say that it is much more difficult for new employees to build culture because they're less able to experience it in person and then have it in their muscle memory the way all the employees who are maintaining it would. So,
Patrick, what are your thoughts both on that question and on the challenges, the infrastructure and operating challenges associated with this, at least for this foreseeable future, this hybrid environment of employees working from home, some in the office, some at other locations, field sites? I know one company, for example, that has, I should say, its traditional Midtown office for 200 employees. And now what they're planning to do over the next year is redistribute that to 5 to 10 field offices of 10 to 20 employees apiece The idea being that if we're going to continue to have offices, we're going to have them closer to where people live, and we're going to have it more distributed to, prevent one place being at risk from a single transmission. I mean, all these changes are happening at lightning speed. What do we have to think about, Patrick, in terms of making it work?
Sure. I think that, again, to Chris's point, we're fortunate that we're in a time where we do have the technology and tools available. Things like remote onboarding and video conferencing, and really designing that new employee experience to transfer the cultural aspects of a new job are important. That comes from even small things like a quick 2-minute recorded video from a hiring manager welcoming you to the team and saying, expect your laptop to arrive via FedEx tomorrow, and here's what we're going to do from there. Our simple gestures, but having that personal touch, having the face to the name, and being able to kind of get on board and make it a real designed interactive experience. I know that Mitch has some experience as well, so I'll defer some of those questions to him, but the tools are available between Zoom, Google Hangouts, WebEx, Teams, things like that are all available to facilitate the conversation. But it's also important from a communication standpoint to really be specific and lay out what the expectations are for those communication types. There are going to be larger, more formal meetings. I have one every Monday with my larger team, about 30 people. We're all on video. It's a facilitated discussion. We go through kind of a weekly agenda. And then more regularly, we have a smaller team, the 4 or 5 of my more immediate colleagues. We talk on a more regular basis just about the daily goals and priorities. But then definitely more overt check-ins, and that can be in the form of text messages or a group chat type of format, or Slack channels, or there are various ways to kind of keep remote teams engaged via communication methods that fit the appropriate communications. There's another side of what the communications look like, and I think you addressed it previously, for the employees that do have to be on site. And part of phase 1 here in New York are the manufacturing and logistics, wholesale industries, as well as construction, where the job is done on site. So it still comes down to, here's what the communication is looking like. Here are the policy rollouts. Here are the education trainings. Here's what we're doing to keep you safe. It starts there. Here are the protections that we've put in place and why. Trainings that you're not only signing off on, but really understanding and enforcing from a leadership perspective, but also just from making it known that it is a priority. And I'll kind of leave it there, because I think that Mitch and Susan can probably add on top of what the communications look like for getting back to what this next normal is.
I like that phrase, and I hadn't thought of it before. So is it trademarked or is it open source?
I believe open source.
He's like, let me check our trademark library. I'll have legal get back to you.
Available, then I'll get a trademark.
Mitch, I've got a question. All the things that Patrick described, they sound like things that would appear to be common sense. But one thing I realized listening to Chris is the amount of forethought that has to go in. Like, honestly, his suggestion of creating open digital meeting rooms, for informal collaboration rather than scheduled, that for some reason hit me as a new idea, even though the ability to do it's right in front of me. I think both of them talked about how to onboard someone. What do we do? How do we get managers and leaders to actually really think through re-choreographing what feels like it should just be natural, but it's not natural? What are your thoughts on that?
So I think a lot of great ideas have been presented, and I think one of the things that is missing in remote work is the casual conversation. So, for Chris's point, having a room that's open is great, as long as other people, if you go in there and there's someone there, or you can Slack or text somebody and say, hey, meet me in here. But I do think that's an excellent idea, that you have a room that's open. I think what kind of a workplace you have really determines how you reevaluate and communicate, and to Chris's point of a plan, what's your plan and what are your priorities, but also explaining. I mean, look, the way that a law firm or an advertising agency is going to work is going to be completely different than the way that a construction site or a meatpacking plant. I mean, you can't work remotely in a meatpacking plant. You have to actually be there, to pack the meat. But I think the big deal is to explain and provide context to your employees about what you're doing, given the necessity to come in for certain purposes. And then when you don't have to come in for those purposes, you can stay home. Susan said something that really struck me, which was, and we're in very similar types of structured businesses, which is, I don't want to ride the subway right now. And we know that there are people who have to ride the subway. And so being empathetic to that and saying, hey, you know what, we're going to provide a kit for everybody that has some wipes and some gloves and, a mask and some paper towels, and that's maybe it'll have our logo on it, and you will take that on the subway with you because we know that you're going to need that. But the other thing is, for instance, we discussed the onboarding process. I think we have to move away. Well, we have to move away from this sort of 15 minutes at the top of every discussion. How you doing? People are tired of that. So check-ins have to look more casual, even if they may be addressing more serious situations. For instance, at the beginning of all this, a lot of my clients weren't personally touched by COVID-19, and now I have two leaders that are very high up in large organizations who have lost a parent or a cousin or a close, a sibling, and that experience is different. It's no longer, okay, how do I put in policies in place? It's also, how do I lead through my own grief? And so understanding that your employees are going to be dealing with that as well, and being able to check in on them in sort of more one-on-one conversations. But the other thing that I really wanted to address, and we talked briefly about this in our sort of pre-meeting, is that we need to be really careful that we're not traumatized out, because we went through COVID, and then we went through, and now we're in actually the police and racial injustice, Black Lives Matter issues. George Floyd's funeral was just yesterday, or the service was just yesterday. And so my fear is that we're going to be like, okay, enough with the crises, let's get back to work, and not take COVID as seriously because we're kind of maxed out emotionally from it. And we need to, as leaders, really reinforce that that it's our job to keep the numbers low. The numbers aren't low by accident. The numbers are low by action. And that we have an obligation to ourselves, corporate social responsibility, to our community, to address both issues, by the way, which we weren't planning on talking about, which are the issues of racial injustice.
They are realities.
And the spread of the continued spread of COVID-19 and how we navigate that. And the over communication that I think Patrick referred to is important. And also that one-on-one communication. And so even I think I've always said, like, managers should be having one-on-ones with their direct reports on a regular basis. And there's a really simple structure that if you get in touch with me, I can send you that I've developed. Very, very simple and effective. But adding in there, how are you doing? What's going on? Is there anything that's going on personally that may affect your work or your ability to work, and how can we help you with that? Can we double people up right now on work because some people are, we know that when we go through trauma, our brains don't function as well as they normally do. And there's neuroscience to back that up. So, really understanding that and helping our employees with empathy, which has been mentioned before, and really providing a lot more context and empathy and opportunities. And I think this goes back to Chris's point of the casual conversation, which happens just because I walked by you in the workplace. That's not happening right now.
So interestingly enough, Mitch, you talked about clients who are personally affected. I have a client who is personally affected by COVID, okay? And I have a client who is personally affected by the unrest in New York, okay? And so let me throw the question out to the two of you who are leaders in large organizations, Chris and Patrick. How are your companies responding to the larger issue of Black Lives Matter, the overall tension about, here we are using police to help manage the COVID epidemic, right? Or at least we have been. Police are supposed to be enforcing social distancing. The parks enforcement officers are doing it in the park system here in New York. And we have this huge movement to reform and rethink our entire culture around that. Like, what are your companies doing or talking about or saying in response to those issues?
Would you like I'll go first.
Yeah, you can go first. That's fine, Chris.
Starters, corporate messaging needs to be no different than what Susan referred to regarding, the COVID pandemic. Every corporate leader of which I'm aware, including all in my organization, have sent a message to their people. Mm-hmm. So, and that's an individual, personal message. I am unlikely to ever be affected personally by systemic racism. Mm-hmm. That's a fact. But the fact that it's not directly a problem doesn't mean it shouldn't be something that I take personally. So that's been my message to my team and my portion of the firm, our CEO, our parent company CEO, everyone. And then now that we've sent messages, I think we obviously need to follow that up with action, and whatever action we promise to take, we need to take. If there's a problem, we need to address it. We have to acknowledge failings where they occur and be very clear, very thoughtful, and let people know that things may change as we know more, because we'll always be trying to do better.
So, go ahead.
Also need to be clear what is and is not acceptable in our workplace. And when you're in the client service business, that means also at a client site. Mm-hmm. And so, and crystal clear about just no tolerance for any of that ever, anywhere. And I think that just needs to be the table stakes. That should be baseline behavior for any organization that's hoping to deal with this and have their employees take it seriously. And it's not just the employees who also would be directly affected, because younger generations, in our organization and others, are more sensitive, polling tells us, and are going to take it personally too, even if it doesn't directly affect them. And so it is a reason to do good, and it may result in doing well, but it's important to do the right thing for the right reason, get the message out, and be crystal clear about what is and is not on your priorities, acceptable, and what you're going to do about it.
Chris, just a follow-up question on that. Anna Wintour came out and said that she acknowledged that there were cultural problems within Vogue and within the media company that were brought to light, and that she took more seriously and had to acknowledge that she hadn't before. And the reason I bring that up is, should it be the position in your mind that unless a company is aware of racial and cultural challenges, that it should assume it's not having those problems? Or do you feel that the real message to employers is, chances are you are having these problems, even if you're not personally aware of them? Now is the time to engage in the discussion to unearth them and try to address them. What are your thoughts?
I would say don't assume you don't have them just because you're not aware of them.
Okay.
You could argue the same side of the coin to say, so assume that you do and act as if you do, and go find it and make sure that you've dealt with it. Mm-hmm. Like don't be comfortable with the fact that you haven't heard of anything so far. And I would tell you that you mentioned when you introduced us what else we do.
Yes.
I would say that is something about which we need to be sensitive in a diocesan volunteer role I have. Mm. And my fiscal control board comes with a 2,000 person police force. Mm. So we have a lot of things going on. And yet I think you need to be, and so far so good, haven't heard anything. Those are all true statements. I'm not aware of any, haven't seen it, but you have to be prepared to recognize it, acknowledge it, and take action in a way that people get that you're doing the right thing.
Mm. Patrick, your thoughts, both on ADP's response to either issue or both issues together, as well as your recommendations for clients.
Sure, I'll keep it quick because I also want to hear from Susan. I think a lot of this stems from the communication and addressing, corporate policy and communications to the community as well as internally. I'm fortunate enough, and part of the reason why I joined ADP is they've always scored very high and ranked well on best companies to work for diversity, equity, inclusion initiatives. Our leadership team is, quite diverse. I don't have the statistics in front of me, but I know that even, for example, our CEO Carlos Rodriguez is Cuban American, as well as some of our other counterparts. And not to say that hides any lower level biases, but corporate communications from a high level saying, this is emphasizing our mission, vision, and values as a larger picture, and kind of a, no tolerance for any transgressions under that, but also doing little things like matching donations to Black Lives Matter, charities, NAACP, things of that nature has been rolled out, and even on the local team level, support for local community organizations has been immense. And making sure that those efforts that we're putting in place not only are helpful currently, but as a really standard practice moving forward, staying in line with that. So, Susan, I'd love to hear kind of your take on it as well.
Yes. Oh, I just need to unmute. There we go.
That's okay. All right. Yeah, I mean, I think so much has been said already that I feel that I would be a little bit repetitive. I think the issue of overly communicating, I know you brought that up, Patrick, and I do think it's important to show your enthusiasm to share your principles, like Chris said, because I think that is the most important thing a leader shows. They have true principles around this time. But each time you communicate, I think you need to communicate and focus on something particular. Like if you're focusing on safety, or you're focusing on, building culture, or you're focusing on community or diversity or giving back. Each time you communicate, I think you need to be very clear that you're focusing on one aspect of your principles. Because I think part of what's going on right now, because there's sort of a overwhelm that we all have to deal with this right and deal with it right now, is that it gets sort of muddied. And I think, one of the key things I always tell my clients is that you really need to be focusing on one thing when you're speaking out, and do that well. And, to pick up, on the issue that I said earlier, I think C-suite people need to be doing more of these direct communications on insights and things like that. Because I notice a lot of my clients are having salespeople or team leaders do it, but I really think if there's a time, now is the time that CEOs and anybody in the C-suite needs to be really out there communicating, on the LinkedIn profiles or on the insider blogs on their websites, and actually making it first person. Because what new employees, like Chris was pointing out, maybe that new employee will never meet that CEO ever or ever see them, but at least maybe if they can identify or be, communicated with about, what that CEO is doing to emphasize and clarify, the principles, whatever it is, at that time of the focus of the story that they're putting out is really important. And I think, the idea of the open rooms, I really like it. What if there was an open room and, maybe once a month, the CEO actually comes into that open room, and an employee who has done well and whatever it is they do for the company has excelled, and then that employee has a one-on-one with the CEO, whether it be virtual or in person. I mean, that's a way to acknowledge and award, and then that would be obviously something you want to communicate in some kind of public way, whether it be just posting it on social media. You maybe, if you do some kind of scholarship or award for people, which one of you brought up, or a GoFundMe to help a group of employees, then you can promote that through some type of communication. So those are my thoughts.
Thank you, Susan. Other inputs on that question? Go ahead, Mitch.
So this becomes, in my mind, almost a series of fireside chats where you're talking about one topic. And I think it should have a cadence. And right now in the month of June, we're dealing with, COVID and coming back to work. We're dealing with Black Lives Matter and injustice and racial injustice. We're also dealing with LGBTQ Pride Month, and a lot of companies want to deal with that, and that's affected greatly by the lack of the ability for members of communities to come together the way that they normally do. But leadership has the opportunity to, even if you're in a small to mid-sized company, to engage employees around these issues through leadership, through discussion. You may not be big enough to have an employee resource group for Black people or for women or for Latinx or for LGBTQ, but maybe creating an opportunity for a less formal gathering for people in those communities and their allies to really talk about, for instance, the intersectionality of the LGBTQ population and Black Lives Matter, because there's a lot of intersectionality that we can look at, and allies. And Chris said, beautifully, I'm not personally affected by this, but it doesn't affect me. I won't be subject to it, but I am personally impacted by it. And I think, that kind of alliance within an organization makes that organization stronger. And those kinds of, I'll use the word gatherings, whether they're in person, on site, if you're there at that point, or whether they are virtual, having these conversations that are not about what's the status of this project, or how far behind are you, or whatever it is, but to really say, we're here to talk about this, and to engage in a discussion that may be more of a social and business combination. That, again, to your point, Susan, I think they need to be focused on a specific topic, and that comes from leadership. And I don't know that even every month is going to be frequent enough at this point. It may be the state of the state vis-a-vis Black Lives Matter this week, the state of the state vis-a-vis the employee safety or customer safety. So there are a lot of opportunities for leaders to actually lead through word and deed.
I also think you brought up a good point, Mitch, just there at the end, which is that you brought it up indirectly. I'm gonna point to it. Employees' perception of time and their perception of support is changing. When you come to the office, like I have a friend who works for Fidelity Investments, right? And so they have centers all around the country, and twice a year, the CEO would go to each location and do an all hands. And, that was like an all day event, right? So now those same employees really need to be hearing almost weekly in smaller segments, so that the event time is shorter, but the frequency needs to be much higher, because otherwise people's risk of feeling disconnected skyrockets. And so I think this brings up a really good summary question, which is, in each of your minds, what are the 2 or 3 biggest things that a CEO needs to be keeping in their mind as they're continuing to move their workforce through this time? And I'll start with Patrick.
Yeah, so when we're talking about these transitions and addressing larger issues from a company standpoint, as far as the next normal, what we're talking about is, what does this shift look like, and potentially how are we reinventing ourselves as an organization from the leadership perspective. It's a lot of the things that we covered here from an employee communication standpoint and from a new policy rollout standpoint, but those are really effects of larger decisions around, are we shifting our business model? Are we still selling our same products to the same customers that we did pre-COVID? And so I think it's important to almost take a half step back from our conversation here, making sure that the company's aligned, and even remote or virtual, that we're all moving in the same direction. that we're clear about the regulatory and competitive environment in your industry and how it may have shifted, and then the true plan for moving forward. The tools are available. You have a lot of great resources here on the panel and through other advisors to help guide through, the execution of those decisions. But really understanding and communicating, here's what we are about as a company, and put the plan into place.
Chris, your thoughts. Thank you, Patrick.
I think they're along similar lines, right? I think you need to be prepared. You need to be thoughtful, and I think you need to communicate regularly. And as I said earlier, be prepared to communicate that things could change from one week to the next, right? That you're on top of it, if you will. All of our earlier conversations have been around messaging and planning. I think one of the things people need to know is that even if you're not planned to handle every event, that at least you have a plan to make a plan. You know how to react, and you're reacting. You just may not be done yet. So.
I like that. Have a plan on how to make a plan, or have a plan on how to respond when you didn't have one.
Well,
Right?
I think the people in the organization don't want to think that nobody in HQ knows what's going on, right? They want to have some sense that we're working on it. We don't have an answer for you, but here's, again, but these are the principles that are guiding us, while you please wait for us, and then you check in and tell people where you stand. You don't let large periods of time go by where because in the absence of that, Susan can tell you this, in the absence of that, you'd probably have people coming to their own conclusions about what you might have told them, and it'll be wrong, right? So. Yeah.
And that brings up, I think back to the Mount Sinai example, because the CEO of the system is, I think, in his early 70s. And so he was actually advised by his physician that if he could, not to stay in New York. So he had a medical basis for his relocation. And on top of that, he made the point that he was working furiously to source masks and other PPE from China at the time. My point being, let's give him the benefit of the doubt and say he had a legitimate reason not to stay in New York, and he was working 24/7 to support his people, but they didn't know it. And so it didn't matter. If people don't know it, it doesn't matter. And so with that, I want to hand it over to Mitch. What allows someone at that level of sophistication and experience to be so blindsided in terms of communicating effectively with their people? And to Chris's point, how do we make sure that HQ communicates that, not that we necessarily have everything perfect, but that we're on it?
That's a great question. And I think it's really key for people to understand that what's occupying our minds 24/7 and maybe keeping us awake at night, other people don't have any way of knowing that unless and until we share it. And a lot of that comes through, when you asked what are some things people should be thinking about, one of the things that I talked about, I wrote down 3 things. Assure and reassure your employees that you're concerned with their safety and the survival of the organization. And also with that to Patrick's point, safety and survival of the individuals and the organization will probably come from some sort of a business model pivot, and people don't like change. So, to be able to guide them through that by over communicating. And yeah, it should be, I'm here in Palm Beach because my doctor ordered me to get out of the city, but I am working furiously. That should never be assumed, right? It should never be assumed that anyone would know that. We must provide context all the time. And then the other 2 things that I wrote down on your original question is, what should people be thinking about as leaders? It's leading and encouraging discussion on topics that we didn't have before, and understanding that, especially as people are working much more effectively at home, it also means, I was in a meeting this morning, and one of the people on the call was a father, and his 10-month-old son was on his lap. And it was like, this is just part of doing business now. We would never say, oh, this is not appropriate. We navigate through that. And, he muted his mic as necessary. But the hard divide between the personal and the professional is moving away a little bit, because we are asking people also, what did we say? People working from home are working 30% longer hours than they were when they were working in the office. So you
Right.
start to have discussion around how the personal impacts the professional without impinging on somebody's actual like privacy. We're talking
Right.
about the personal versus the private.
You said
And then-
this as my cat just jumped on the back of my chair while I'm moderating a webinar.
Well, that could have been in the office during things with pets to do it too. But the other thing is, and Chris, I think, alluded to this, is you've got to make sure that as a leader that you are aligning your entire workforce around who your customer is, and making sure that everyone is focused on what products and services you're actually offering for whom, and whether, to Patrick's earlier point, do they still need what you were offering? Do you offer something different? Are they satisfied and happy? All of those kinds of stuff, of things that everyone should be pointed toward. And I think those are the three things that people should focus on as senior leaders, and not delegating these important conversations to other people, but literally have, you hate to use this phrase, but a trickle-down effect. The leader of the company should be addressing the entire organization, but then each leader in the org chart should be mirroring that message as appropriate for their level in the org.
Thank you, Mitch. Susan, we want to give you a chance to give your thoughts. We've got a couple minutes left. What are your key points of advice or recommendation?
Well, I just want to pick up on actually what Mitch just
Sure.
about the personal and the professional, because I think, with this environment that we're working with Zoom and Skype and whatever technology people are using, prior to this particular crisis, this was actually being used by a fewer group of people and mainly for personal interaction. And I think a lot of these CEOs never even, I'm not saying the millennials, the people who were used to this and started working on it, but a lot of them never even used this platform. So I think really the same kind of restrictions that, companies often think about that they should do for mid to lower employees should actually be imposed on CEOs. We don't really need to know that they're in Palm Beach. It's really not the company's business. I think some of these CEOs need to ratchet back and not be sharing so much about what they're doing personally, particularly if people in their companies are suffering in whatever way, by health, by financial reasons.
Right.
That would be number one. That really goes to the empathy, right? But it's empathy, and also, use a little self-control and learn how to use these platforms, but use them for the professional reasons. And I guess, the other thing sort of picks up a little bit on what both Patrick and Chris were saying. Show direction, show that no matter what's happening, if your company, has a particular focus in what you're doing, that, if you have product launches planned and things like that, but if your company has to pivot, like I think I mentioned once before, I did have a company that was working in, healthcare environment and predictive cleaning. Now they're really focused on contact tracing, So sometimes companies are going to pivot because based on the news, but be prepared to, show that pivot. And when you communicate it, make it clear that how that's going to interact to what your company represented before. And just one other thing I wanted to add, and I think this is really tactical, but this whole idea of podcasts. I notice a lot of companies are doing podcasts more than before. I mean, it's not a new method, but I think that's another way that leaders could actually engage with their employees. Maybe an employee wins that award, and then that employee gets to do an interview with the CEO. And that's a great idea for them to actually not only, get their point of view out and share their principles and whatever their direction is, but also awards the employee for what their good, performance has been. So those are my thoughts.
That's a spectacular idea. And I also like the fact that it ties into, it is a medium of technology that works whether people are in the same time zone, different time zones. It solves the problem of people being distributed and having different time frames when they could listen. We are right at 1 o'clock, and I feel like we could go another hour. I know we could. This has been an outstanding discussion. It has been enlightening. I've been taking notes. I'm sure everyone who's joined us has as well. So as we conclude, I just want to reiterate that we've recorded this. We will be sharing it again by email with our participants and attendees, as well as on social media via YouTube and other channels. So in conclusion, my thanks to Susan Asadi, Mitch Lippman, Chris Wright, and Patrick Sullivan, all of whom are members of the B2B Growth Forum New York chapter, bringing their expertise to everyone in today's program. Thank you all so much for your time today and for being a part of this program. All right, have a great day, everyone. Again, thanks so much. Bye-bye.